people use ad blockers. They don't want to be in advertisements. I think AR is kind of one of the only use cases where people opt into advertising. If you go to an AR branded experience or a virtual reality branded experience, you're unconsciously becoming a brand ambassador by either sharing that or engaging yourself with it. And I think it's one of the only few instances where you have customers who are choosing to engage with a brand or an advert out of choice and wanting to share it and almost become ambassadors in their own right.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of Create Tomorrow. My name is Kraggy and I'm a print and graphics strategist on the WGSN fashion team. And the voice you just heard was that of creative technologist and leader figure in the augmented reality space, Ommy Akhe. If you're a WGSN subscriber, you may know that twice a year we hold Trends Days, where our teams come together to explore regional representations of where the future is going. As part of our most recent Trends Days, I was joined in conversation by Ommy, as well as Nell Lloyd-Malcolm, CEO and co-founder of XYdrobe, and Royce, who is the head of apparel and digital goods at Fnatic, and we explored fashion's opportunity in digital goods. Digital assets have been reported on by WGSN for many years now, but we're seeing a significant rise in the engagement across markets, regions, categories, and consumer cohorts. Approximately 70% of Gen Z and Gen X global consumers rate their digital identity as important, while 65% rate digital ownership as important, and more than 50% are interested in purchasing a digital asset in the next 12 months. Along with this demand comes exciting opportunities for brands to claim ground in this new space. And as Ommy explained in the clip at the start, new rules are being written on how consumers are willing to interact with brands digitally. In this conversation, my guest and I discuss what the implications of these new rules are and how fashion companies can authentically engage in this space. First though, I wanted to find the lessons that the fashion industry could learn from adjacent industries, in particular the gaming space. And for that answer, we turn over to Royce. We know that fashion can't operate in a vacuum in this space. It needs to strategically partner with and learn from adjacent industries. Ollie, I'd quite like to start with you actually, considering your work at Fnatic and the slew of recent fashion brands collaborating in this space. What lessons do you think fashion can still learn from the gaming space?
I think it's a good question. I think one of the reasons I moved from traditional, like physical product design to gaming is with the recognition that people in gaming have been buying ways to express themselves from a stylistic perspective in games for years. Fnatic is 18 years old this year. So we've been going on for a really long time. And I think you spoke about recent prevalence and rise of, ways to express your style online through being able to extend your presence in the digital world. I think I got really interested there and thought, well, the industry closest to being able to support those mechanisms or being able to enable transactions or people being able to show up online expressing their style is gaming. And I think that was the reason that I made that jump and the reason that there's a lot of brands looking at gaming at the moment as a really, engaging way to enter the space. I think the other part about gaming and what we've seen from and my time in gaming especially is the way that people express themselves further or more creatively or with more freedom of expression than the physical world allows. And there's loads of great reports of people like playing in opposite genders than they are in the real world, or not identifying gender at all, or really being able to amp up things past social confines or norms or any restrictions they feel through their physical body. So I think gaming and that ability to express yourself further is probably my first point about where fashion can really double down on.
Nell, I'd love to ask you, what inspired the move from visual effects? What transferable skills did you see there? What brought that on?
It was a combination of things actually, because I've always really loved fashion. Before I went into film, I did a very brief stint working in fashion in the PR world. I was doing it for, a year probably. And then I got a job classically, as it always goes in film, getting people coffee on set. And then I snowballed from there and I carried on. And I think I've always sort of kept my eye on the virtual fashion space and what I was seeing out there, because really within visual effects, it's kind of fascinating because for the last sort of 40 years, they've held on to the most amount of investment in creating completely photorealistic computer-generated imagery. And that's really because it's been the most kind of predominant place where we've needed it, because we have 2D plates that we need to mesh computer CG into to make it look completely perfect. And so there's been billions and billions of pounds and dollars being invested into this area of visual effects for film. And what we noticed, the germ of the idea really was the fact that there was this quite major quality discrepancy from what I was used to seeing in my day job, sitting in dark editing suites in these amazing, massive post-production facilities, and noticing that there's this huge market elsewhere, and that it kind of was being a little bit ignored by film for various reasons that I'll probably get into later on. But I think for me, it was really about noticing that there was this amazing ability to capture the quality that so many luxury brands really are after. And I wanted to know why that really wasn't being capitalized upon in any other space, really. So that was sort of it. We sort of went on a bit of a fact-finding mission more than anything else, when me and my two co-founders sat down at the beginning of last year to really get an understanding. And they both come from luxury fashion themselves. And we couldn't really find the answers between us. So we started talking to brands, and a lot of it was about quality. But, that was the germ of the idea anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. Both industries feel like they've been doing it for decades, basically now. And all of the technical skill is already there in the gaming space and in the visual effects space. And it's only recently that luxury brands are jumping on it and really hot on it now, but are waking up to, hey, we need to go beyond fashion designers and skill force to actually develop what we're going to do next, right?
Well, I think that's it. I think it's a lot about, the quality that, I think there's a little bit of snobbery on both sides of the kind of coin, and the sense of luxury fashion being luxury fashion, and maybe the gaming industry prior to the last couple of years would have been something that they may not have ever really entertained. And in the same way that with visual effects going into fashion, this kind of cross-contamination of skill sets and understandings and consumer bases, and recognizing there's a value in all consumer bases, not just one subsection that you believe to be the only consumer base you speak to. And I think that's really where we see this lovely kind of ability of these incredible artists working in visual effects in film now being able to go on and do elsewhere, whether that's gaming, whether that's virtual product, whether that's augmented reality. There's so many different applications that benefit the customer journey. And if we're talking about a capitalism sense of what we're discussing with luxury fashion, ultimately it's that conversion rate from someone who's a looker to a buyer.
I'm Kraggy, and you're listening to a special bonus episode of Create Tomorrow from WGSN. In this conversation from WGSN's most recent Trends Days, we're exploring how the fashion industry can grapple with the opportunities in digital ownership. Next up, I want to find out from Ommy Akhe what the motivations are for companies moving into the augmented and extended reality spaces. Ommy, your field of augmented reality is probably arguably the most accessible and frictionless entry point into this space, I'd say. Like, what do you think the commercial benefits are of fashion companies investing in extended reality, XR?
Of course. I mean, the first thing is kind of laying down the facts and the trajectory of technology in the future. A lot of major platforms and companies, whether it be Apple, Meta, Snapchat, Magic Leap, HTC, I can go on, they're all building AR headsets. They're going to be the new mobile phone. And the more proactively people are in getting on board with the new technology, the lower the risk of them being left behind is. So to me, that's the most obvious point. But also thinking about other aspects, I mean, the way that e-commerce is going, especially due to the pandemic, I feel like there's been a real drastic shift in consumer behavior. People are more digitally native. You now have younger consumers with larger spending power. And from a brand, I think it's important to kind of adapt to those new needs in order to maintain brand relevancy for number one. You're thinking about, I think it's in 2025, I think e-commerce is going to be the main distribution channel for the selling of luxury goods. And just being able to iterate quickly and being able to jump on trends as a brand, I think is something that's extremely valuable, especially in the digital realm. On top of that, digital products are infinitely scalable, which means there's a high profit margin. You only have to build something once, and then that can be rolled out 1 time, 2 times, 1 million times if you choose to. Another commercial benefit is people are less likely to return things, especially when you're talking about XR. I think there's like a huge drastic difference. It's around 40%, 20 to 40% of a lesser amount of returns when people are able to try things on using AR or 3D visualization. But to me, it's really important, especially as brands, being able to be on that cusp of technology. If you're able to iterate and build alongside with the platforms that are building the hardware and the technology as well, you're also able to shape that trajectory as well. You're able to start a conversation. You're able to draw attention to your brand through just general discourse and conversation of being an innovative and creative brand. And those are the types of things that lead to direct profitability as well. So there's loads of reasons. I'm passionate about it, but I think loads of brands need to start incorporating digital into their strategy a lot more, because it's more of a necessity than a luxury at this point. And I think that's something that people are now just grappling to come to terms with since the pandemic more than anything.
Well, so when you mentioned the lack of returns, obviously you're talking about like AR try-ons, but
yes,
it got me thinking about returning digital items as well. Like that is not really something you hear of at the moment, right?
It does happen. It's really interesting, actually. I know that Ollie mentioned before people buying skins in games, and that's been something that's been going on for years. It's odd because you don't really think about buying into a software ecosystem. I don't think about buying an app, but it's a digital product that I think everybody has purchased at some point, and it's something that's totally normalized now. But in terms of returns, like things like Oculus, if I buy a VR game and I don't like it within 14 days, I can return it. And to me, that's something that I found really interesting and kind of encourages people to kind of take risks when it comes to things in that space as well.
I wanted to add to that if I could, which is like to your point around the change being accelerated by the pandemic, right? It's like when COVID first came around, we first went into lockdown, most of the brands that were selling only physical product had to model zero revenue overnight, right? It was like, if I can't get the postman to deliver it because he's off sick or the warehouse closes, that's it. And it was like looking at digital revenue and saying like, this can still be shipped. It doesn't need to sit on a hanger. Like it has so many commercial benefits for a brand. It's insane in terms of the economics of product. And then the second bit I really agree with that you said was product relevancy. It's like the brands, like the 16 to 25 audience, so hard to market to or so hard to get their attention. We have a bunch of insights that they're using ad blockers on their web browsers, like very hard to get the attention of for longer than 10 seconds. And the thing about gaming was like people play games for hours at a time. Like you have undivided attention, like they live and breathe it. And we just partnered with Gucci for that very reason. It was like, we want to get in front of these people. We want to remain relevant. We know this group have spending power or will have spending power in the future. So to your point on it, the relevance to a brand from a commercial perspective and remaining current is so right, so true.
Gamified retail is the next thing, surely. It's gotta keeping that attention is just so worthy right now, right?
I heard someone say the other day, well, actually, I didn't come up with it, but I was walking down the road and my son went, V-commerce. And then I looked up on Google and annoyingly, it's a total thing. But it's all of that. It's that luxury brand idea of entering into a virtual space that I think is really heavily reliant on the experiential. And all brands ever want to do is more explain who they are, what their communication of the creative director is, how they get that across to a user. And I think one side of it is for the younger generation who are very used to that gamified environment. And then there's this whole other section of their consumer base who are luxury consumers who don't game, who don't own a VR headset, who don't understand. And so that is a very large portion of the kind of problem that I guess we're trying to solve, is that idea of creating something that is in that space, but is directed towards a luxury consumer, which is a very interesting place to be in, I guess, because whilst it is trying to remain relevant with the technology we're using, it's sort of shifting it ever so slightly to keep it as accessible as possible. And a large portion of that, to be honest, is from AR. And to Ommy's point, I think AR is the most brilliant kind of use case for those people who don't know or aren't VR native yet. So yeah.
It's really interesting as well when you think about AR, just because as you were saying before, like people they use ad blockers. They don't want to be in advertisements. I think AR is kind of one of the only use cases where people opt into advertising. If you go to an AR branded experience or a virtual reality branded experience, you're unconsciously becoming a brand ambassador by either sharing that or engaging yourself with it. And I think it's one of the only few instances where you have customers who are choosing to engage with a brand or an advert out of choice and wanting to share it and almost become ambassadors in their own right, as opposed to the more conventional instances where you pay to kind of avoid that advertising.
This is a special episode of Create Tomorrow for WGSN, highlighting a conversation which took place as part of WGSN's most recent Trends Days. We're discussing all things virtual in the world of fashion. I wanted to find out more about how consumers were actually engaging with digital objects and how they can connect with real-world events and marketing opportunities. For that, let's turn to Nell Lloyd-Malcolm. Maybe back to Nell. XYdrobe already do virtual wearability and a load of different AR as well. I'm right in thinking. How do you see those use cases evolving for fashion, though? How are people going to actually be engaging with these items?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think we're right at the start of our evolution, our virtual evolution, if you will. I do think that the more kind of mass that people start engaging with virtual product, the more we're going to see more virtual spaces crop up that are more popularized that are probably away from gaming, from the traditional, Fortnite. I think is going to become this entire, behemoth unto itself. But I do think there are going to be loads of other virtual spaces that are going to crop up, based on whether that's social ideologies or just, brand preference. And I think one of the most interesting things outside of just wearability is this use case for brands to start creating a hyper engaged community of their own that, by buying into virtual product, you're able to actually receive real world perks, whether or not that's access to shows, access to unique product lines. There's so much you can do with the aim to one day become, virtual only product, because I think that's the very key thing for them at the moment, is that it's got to be somewhat paired with physical. I think for their kind of main subsection of consumer of virtual product, it makes sense for them to make sure that someone is getting something tangible because they're so new to the space. But I think the kind of future use cases of it are always going to be rooted in wearability, because that's what clothes are. But I do think there is this amazing opportunity to build that community, which I think luxury brands are always trying to strive towards. Creating really close connections with their consumers is the top of their list. And providing someone with an ability and having greater access to someone because they've purchased a virtual item is probably going to be where we see things sort of becoming a little bit more exciting. What we get in return for, rather than it just being a piece of clothing, which is amazing, it can mean so many other things as well. So yeah.
I think even from a financial standpoint as well, like retaining customers and retention is always going to be more cost effective than acquisition. As a brand, rather than wanting to outreach and gain new customers, it makes sense to build brand loyalists out of the customers you have already. So I think that only just adds to the value of having online communities.
Building your your autonomous organization, decentralized autonomous organization. Yeah, I mean, I heard a really good point the other day that everyone talks about how these virtual items will unlock all, your tickets to all of these things, and you can do this and that, right? But what no one was kind of saying to brands at the start was, don't just release an NFT purely because you want to say you own it and it's one of one. Because not only, and this was a point from Metaverse Luke's podcast, not only is it going to just sit in someone's wallet and practically just be a reminder that NFT was a waste of investment and it hasn't unlocked anything for you later, whereas all the other stuff that you've collected is suddenly unlocking things for you. So it can diminish your brand if you don't do it right.
Well, that's exactly it. Sorry, I'll just add to that, because I think one of the key things that is really important and has been a big learning curve from a lot of the time what we're communicating when we meet brands and work with brands is about this concept of an NFT, the virtual product. Is it going to be defunct in the next 6 months? Because a lot of the time people are purchasing 2D images of virtual goods, which has its place within the NFT world. There is obviously a very big market for collectibles like that. And I think one of the biggest things for clothing brands to recognize is the idea that you need the NFT to be a 3D file. You need the 3D source file to be available to the person who's bought it, but also preferably the company you bought it from, because without that 3D source file, you're not going to be able to ultimately be able to turn it into a real-time asset. You're not going to have it as a as a virtual ready asset. You're not going to be able to do all of these other amazing things, whether that's AR, whether that's 3D printing, whether that's, displaying it in a holographic box on your desk. That's a very key thing. And I guess that's just based from the fact that, the understanding about what visual effects is, what these kinds of artists do, the difference between having a 3D file and having just a 2D image of a 3D file is not really something that has been communicated all that much. And so once you have that, as long as you know that you own it, you own that 3D file, then I would say that's the biggest takeaway I always tell to brands is just make sure that you are getting that source file and you're not just getting an image.
Yeah, it comes down a lot to education, and as you were saying before, like interoperability, I can never say that word, it's such a big thing. I mean, coming down to that argument, whether you're giving people 3D assets or 2D images of 3D assets, and kind of giving the brand being able to kind of give that control to their purchaser or their customer is something that they're struggling a lot with as well. Whether we like it or not, like the truly decentralized platforms don't exist yet, or there aren't very many of them. And it's important that as we're creating assets, especially with working with brands now, we're entirely honest about it. We try and create things that have as much utility in the future as possible, but these are not always things that we can guarantee. So I think a lot of trust is required on both ends, whether it be from the brand perspective, the creator perspective, the consumer perspective, and just making sure that people are like wholeheartedly in and believe in the ecosystem that they're buying into or trying to build as well.
Yeah, and actually being able to trust that those assets can be taken across future-proof and across advertising and merchandising and everything like that. It's not just a one garment or one file. It's an asset that the brand can use for literally anything. And that's going to save them time and money, right?
Totally. And just to add to that one point, because there's so much to say about this actually, because I think from the people, whether or not you have a 3D source file, that's one thing. But then I think we're going to see this really interesting shift of artists capable of turning that 3D file into something else in a either quality driven way or a very stylized way. We're going to see a really dramatic shift of actually there's going to be a huge amount more people capable of doing that work. At the moment, the subsection of people capable of taking a Houdini file is something that we work with a lot in visual effects, and turning it into something else, it's pretty slim because it's a very kind of niche piece of software that has not been democratized yet. And so there is this, I think we're going to see a big shift in the quality driven 3D source file, 3D computer generated work. And it's going to get down to the point where we're going to obviously recognize that the whole generation below us are learning these skills already. And I would love to see, more people learning piece of software like Houdini and Maya, and bringing that into everywhere else, because I do think that there is also this lack of understanding about the type of artists you need to produce the 3D work that you need to produce. And again, that's just because this is right at the start. Visual effects hasn't spanned out into any other industry yet properly. Obviously, this is a year in. But yeah, that's just something else I wanted to say on that.
It's quite a race to be the tool that everyone's going to use. Is it Unreal Engine? Is it Unity? Is it what are creators going to use next? Is it just even Blender, which is free? It's like what are people going to use? You're listening to Create Tomorrow from WGSN. We're discussing fashion in the digital and virtual world. Now that we've established the opportunities for brands in Web3, I want to dive deeper into the aesthetics of our virtual landscape and what are our guiding forces for aesthetic trends in this digital space. Ollie, you're in the gaming space. You've obviously seen a lot of brands jump on the hyper gaming look and lots of neon sort of colors and things like that. How do you see that evolving? Is that here to stick around, or is that going to translate into like a softer way, or is it going to go completely unrealistic and we're all going to be wearing fire in Ommy's AR like filters or something?
That's the beauty of the space, right? Is that the freedom to go all the way is something that it enables. So I actually love the idea that something open and democratized can actually be a champion for full-scale creativity, especially when it's in the hands of the owners. I think one point, I think this mirrors what you guys are already saying, is like it still needs to be a good product. It's like whether it's digital or physical, or you're bringing two brands together to collaborate in the gaming space, if a proposition isn't compelling, or the designs aren't interesting enough, or it isn't something someone wants to collect, or it isn't engaging enough, it's still going to fall down in the way that would have fallen down in the real world. I think with that rush to get into the digital space, there's been a lot of overlooking of like, what is a proposition? Like, why would someone be excited to buy it and own it and collect it? And I think from the unicorns, you can see they've got it really right, have really nailed exactly what their proposition is, or what is unique in that space, or where they would generate the demand. So in terms of stylistic preferences, I think we announced a partnership with ASOS last year, and their mantra is about amplification of people's style. And they just looked at the gaming world and the space and thought, well, think how much further we can go here, and with the use of AR and VR, like how we can overlay existing outfits and amplify them and extend them, or make them come to life in a way that wasn't possible before, to really, exaggerate someone's online stylistic preference, I guess. And I think that would be one example of a brand coming into a gaming space for reasons of extending what they're already about and going further with it. And I think the beauty of the space is that you can go very far and then not feel like you're walking down the street and too many people are looking at you.
Sort of speaking of walking down the street and people looking at you, Ommy, you're obviously working with Snap Specs. As soon as Apple releases some sort of augmented glasses as well, I'm sure there'll be a mass adoption there. What are you excited to see in this aesthetics? Because you're making a lot of kinetic prints and reactive prints. Are we all going to be wearing the glasses and everyone's going to be changing the color of their dress with their hand gestures, or what's next on that?
I hope so. I mean, to me, like as Ollie was saying, the aesthetics are kind of number one. I say this to platforms all the time. It doesn't matter how advanced your technology is. If it doesn't look good, especially when you're talking with fashion, people aren't going to buy it. People aren't going to wear it. People aren't going to engage with it. So in many cases, aesthetics come before functionality for me, or anything else along that sense, because it is so important, especially when you're in a field that's very much rooted in vanity. I think a lot of it does come down to giving the user control. I think this is the case in a lot of industries, and it's parallel in a lot of industries. The creator economy is really important. Customization and personalization is something that I really value, especially in emerging technology. As somebody who loves fashion and really likes luxury fashion, even though it's very expensive, I probably shouldn't be, it is quite interesting to see how silhouettes of products, I find like fashion design is quite iterative, in that the designs very much remain the same in terms of silhouettes and shapes. It's usually colorways, patterns, and collaborations that usually change. To me, especially from a sustainable point of view, it didn't make much sense to be buying the same product every season, just because in this season it was acid green, and in this season it's now Kelly green. These are things that to me can be substituted in a digital sense, which is kind of where I started my research and development into, as I like to call it, digital skinning. We're very much an Instagram generation, as I like to call it. We only kind of care about what we post online in many cases. I have conversations with friends that are like, I can't wear this again because people have seen it on my Instagram grid. So that's out of the question. And I'm thinking it's a perfectly good outfit. What's the problem? And I think that's what kind of rooted my idea of kind of using AR as a port of utility. Why do we need to buy so many things when we can easily mask them or create contextually aware experiences using augmented reality or other emerging technology? The contextually aware aspect, so doing things like your products changing based on the environment you're in, or any products that you have associated with it, what mood you're in, where you are in the world. These are all things I think really amplify existing clothing. The tangible experience in the physical product, I think, is still very important. There's a lot of hesitation with luxury brands, especially venturing into augmented reality and emerging technology, because they're heritage brands with a lot of emphasis on craftsmanship and the physical product. And that's where a lot of the apprehension comes in. So to me, it was about creating ideas or creating implementations that still honor the physical product. To me, there's nothing more exciting than holding a leather bag and being able to sniff it and like looking at the stitching. Maybe I'm a nerd, but I really like looking at stitching. And to kind of remove that element of the user journey, to me, sounded a bit like almost sad, and I'd understand why brands would be apprehensive to these things. So to me, it was about using augmented reality to, number one, augment your reality, but also be complementary to physical items, as I think that was the point of augmented reality in the first place. So making sure that you are still honoring the physical product, that craftsmanship can also still be valued. But then also on a more practical sense, if I've spent all of my money buying virtual goods or virtual fashion and suddenly my AR glasses die, what am I going to wear to go and hang out with my friends? There's nothing there. So to me, like, the future of AR is more about the marrying of the two technologies rather than honoring one or the other, and kind of really amplifying the physical product with technology, whether that be 5G, GPS, whatever, but making sure both are being upheld in their own respective ways.
No, that all sounds great, and that's like probably quite forward thinking, but what are the barriers to entry at the moment? Like, how can we get people to adopt for this on a commercial scale?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think just to talk about your original question in regards to aesthetics, because I think it's a really interesting thing that we certainly noticed at the start of this journey for us, which maybe even pre this journey. I think anything that we'd seen outside in virtual fashion, virtual luxury fashion, because we hadn't seen any kind of real known brands enter that space at that point, outside of any gamified assets. You know, Balenciaga entering what they did with Fortnite is an amazing example. But away from that, you know, known brands who are very legacy driven, like Ommy was saying, I think there was this real aesthetics sort of trend that we saw with virtual only fashion brands, which is very much based in this kind of, maybe we would class it as retro futuristic at this point, but it's very futuristic in its aesthetic. And I think a lot of that was based out of the fact that it was a stylistic choice. Like I was saying, it goes back to that quality driven approach that, you know, reaching that level of quality is something that a very kind of small subsection of people understand and know how to do. It just hasn't been democratized yet. So I think there's a lot of respect I have for the virtual fashion brands that have been doing it for the last, 10, sometimes years, in the choices they've made about the aesthetics, because I think they've done extraordinarily well. And then it goes down to, how do we get luxury brands involved in a virtual space? And I think for us, that was our main kind of point of call, was to start talking to brands and understanding what it was that they were struggling with. And I think the key barriers for entry that they were finding was about the quality. I think, again, it was from their point of view, the education level about what can really be achieved if you've got the right level of talent. And I think that's another big thing for them to understand, is that, and others who haven't worked in visual effects, is this idea that it's not a piece of software. It's not someone pressing a button. It's human beings sat behind computers working sometimes extraordinary hours to make the work that we're seeing in our cinemas, but now pushing that out into luxury fashion. I think we're, a good few years, maybe 10 to 20 years away from where we have some kind of, this white whale of a piece of software that can produce this amazing quality asset that is fiber level detail without the need of human intervention or human talent. And I think the barrier for entry with quality was us kind of educating that, how we get to that amazing level of craft. Because ultimately, if we're talking about the JW Anderson cardigan, for example, our artists basically went through the exact same process as what the head of knitwear designer Yanni did at JW Anderson. They created every single piece of fiber and every single piece of yarn as its own piece of 3D geometry before procedurally knitting it together. And that's what gave it that amazing 3D look and feel. It's almost like you could feel it. It looked completely identical, to the point where when we actually released it to press, nobody understood that it was actually a 3D garment. And so we had to do a breakdown video. And so there's one thing in the quality. The other thing is based around equity. Is for them, if you're Gucci, if you're Givenchy, if you're Prada, you've already got an amazing .com presence. You have people wanting to come to your website. You have your in-store presences globally. And I think there was this big kind of, when you need NFTs and when you need cryptocurrency to sell virtual product, they were concerned about the fact that they were going to have to direct the actual point of sale away to a third-party vendor, because they're all trying to become D2C as much as they possibly can. And I think those were the biggest two barriers that we noticed, was quality being one, equity being another. And then there's lots of others. There's so many, because lack of time is another. They've got 4 shows to do every single year, produce sometimes up to 70 looks in some shows. It's a very minute and very rigid schedule that they're already working towards, and it's a successful schedule for them, an extremely successful schedule for them. So actually injecting virtual product into it, it had to be so low effort for them that it made sense. It has to be something that they can completely trust. The virtual product is going to match what they're actually creating in real life as well, because like Ommy was saying, I firmly believe in the concept that we're never going to have virtual only product. We're always going to need the nice cross section between physical and virtual when you're talking about luxury fashion. That is, people are always going to need something to wear. And I think having that education of what that could really look like. Yes, it can look like your real item that you've spent sometimes hundreds of years crafting. If we're talking about an Hermes bag, for example, that IP has been around for years, and they're never going to release a product that looks subpar to what can really be bought in store. And it's about, probably at first instance for us, it's about slotting into what they already have and trying to make something work with the time they have, rather than trying to revolutionize the entire way that they think, because it's an incredibly kind of legacy driven industry, and it's one that is also working very well.
That kind of hits on the luxury market. I kind of want to, Ollie, is it the same for like the commercial sort of gamers, this younger generation as well? Is it the same thing? Do they care about the quality, or are they okay with just virtual skins? What's the sort of aim in that cohort? Are they fast?
We have a similar debate internally all around like how much of it needs to be tangible versus how much can be owned. I think the adoption of traditional I guess like ways of selling, or adoption of like memberships or mechanisms that people are used to in their relationship with product or bought product, innovated by a digital space, makes it easier to adopt. So I'll give you an example. When Artifact started, the reason they started in trainers, right, is because they knew people like collecting trainers in the real world. They were like, okay, they can still collect them, they just can't wear them. And it's like the collection mechanism was the bit that was transferred over to the digital world, but it's a traditional concept. I think the same about memberships, where you get utility or access or first access to a gig ticket or something. It's just being innovated by the ability to be on chain or being associated with the product that's purchased. I think that's a really easy way for a brand to find a crossover, provided it's a traditional model that someone understands, or in the way that they buy an own product. Having said that, I think probably where like gaming is different, or the two major differences for gaming, is that gaming at the moment is a very male-dominated space. It's really interesting that there's so much purchasing of stylistic items for characters being made by people that are traditionally less style conscious or less invested in a fashion space. So the dynamic is slightly different. And then the other thing is price points. Like the digital products that people are buying are luxury price points. It's kind of like, how are you creating luxury digital brands in a new luxury definition, where it's about delivering quickly and expensively? And I think that changes the mechanism slightly. But like digital games and items like can generate well over 500,000 every time they're released. So like there's serious revenue potential there too.
But that speaks to the point that, as Ollie's saying about it being, there's a very obvious usability for those items. And as soon as we have a very obvious usability in a virtual space that is maybe more dedicated towards a luxury consumer, it's going to become very obvious why you would want to own a virtual item. It's just that we don't have that yet. And the gaming space has been one that has had that for many years now. So I'm not surprised. I just think that there's going to be that replicated in other ways as well, which is really interesting.
I think it's really interesting as well, because I mean, you have the example, I think it was Gucci that sold a sneaker on Roblox, and it sold for more than the retail price of the original sneaker. There's a real power, I think, in being able to duplicate a digital asset as many times as you want, but choosing not to. And I think it's that idea of scarcity, whether it be in physical luxury goods, where it's perceived scarcity, but also digitally, where that scarcity becomes the crucial point of what makes an item be considered a luxurious item or a luxury product as well.
Sort of looking forward, so we're right at this point where a lot of the tech is really shaking up what's coming up in this digital space. There's loads of conversations about Web3 and what that might mean for brands. Brands obviously really want to get inside there, but the sort of whole premise of Web3 is rectifying that power imbalance across creator economics and that conversation between the consumer and the brand, right? So just a final point from each of you, perhaps. What would you say to brands trying to ready themselves or get in on this virtual goods or next digital space, what would be your sort of standout advice to tell them?
I think I can only really speak to the knowledge base that I have, which is very much in the luxury space. So I'm going to keep it to that sector. I say the biggest takeaway for me is understand which consumer you're really trying to target. Are you trying to convert the 99% of your existing consumer base who are not NFT or crypto native? Are you trying to gather new consumers inside the younger generations, the Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas? Are you trying to position yourself in a gamified environment? Or, 9 times out of 10, when we speak to brands, it's a lot about retaining their level of, like I said, quality and aesthetic that they've already cultivated in real life. And if that is the case, then I would seriously consider creating a strategy that's dedicated towards what your v-commerce space is going to look like, and understanding that whatever NFT you create, it needs to be a 3D file that is going to be wearable in the future for it to retain its value. And seriously start considering what your virtual product pipeline is really going to look like. Is it going to be paired with physical product? I would say, again, 9 times out of 10, it's wise. Unless you are someone like a Balenciaga and a Gucci, I'd say please pair it with a physical product, because I think the main consumer base of yours is going to need that tangible product as well. And yeah, start thinking about what your v-commerce landscape is going to look like, and putting nice benefits in for those people who are adopting this technology early.
It's all very, very sound advice and strategy there. Very sound advice. Ommy, how about you? Is it people going straight into VR or filters, or what would you sort of say?
I always say approach with caution is usually my first advice that I give potential clients or anybody who's curious about the space, and do your research. I think it's very easy, especially if you see somebody else lead by example, to want to emulate what they've done because you've seen it be successful. I think staying true to the pillars of your brand, for example, if you're a brand rooted in sustainability, maybe not releasing an NFT using Ethereum is the best use case for you. I think making sure that what you're doing in the digital space is equivalent to the brand values in the physical brand is the most important thing. Speak to experts, use creators, value the existing communities that are already there in these spaces. The communities have been there for a very long time, despite the fact that it's come to maybe mainstream attention very recently. So make sure that you're almost like visiting another country. Just make sure you're doing it with respect, and you're paying as much caution as you can to the new environment that you're delving in with. And other than that, just have fun, iterate as much as you can, experiment. There's no such thing as a huge mistake unless you're being super offensive. So just kind of have fun with it. I think the more exploration we do in this space, the more things advance. I think having a wide range of perspectives really opens up this perspective of other people, especially the people building the technology as well. There's lots of instances where I'll speak to platforms because a client has asked for something and it wasn't even the platform's mind, and now suddenly it becomes a priority. So I think kind of just enabling communication and having that flow of communication, I think, is super important as well. And just listen.
Ollie, over to you. Does everyone need to get a gaming skin in, or is that just jumping on the bandwagon?
It's really hard to follow such solid advice. But I like, my first bit of advice, or my first point is like, please don't start with an NFT. It's not first out the gate. I think take time to understand what Web3 stands for and the motivations that are driving it, and the pillars around being more transparent with your community, decentralizing some decision-making in your brand, allowing people to come into the creative process, and enabling shared ownership. Doesn't necessarily have to just be of the physical product out the other side. It could be in voting rights, for example, on a shift forwards towards a more sustainable direction. So I think like, listen to Ommy's point, understand the space, understand what's driving it, and then decide what to do for your brand and where you fit in, because NFTs is one route, in-game items is another, but the scope and the way the brand needs to evolve to remain that, I guess, like, to find a space in Web3, there's like a lot more social and economic drivers that are worth considering.
A huge thanks to my guests Ommy Akhe, Nell Lloyd-Malcolm and Oliver Royce for taking part in this conversation for Trends Days. If you're a WGSN subscriber, you can find many more reports covering Web3, virtual, augmented and extended reality, the metaverse and fashion in the digital space on our website. If you want to find out how to subscribe, please head over to WGSN.com to discover how you can get access to our service. We're constantly publishing new content focusing on how we can design a brighter, better future for our industries, including food and drink, beauty, interiors, fashion, and consumer tech. You can subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms. And if you like what you've heard, why not give us a rating and review? That just leaves me to thank our producers, Bethan Ryder and Roland Bodenham, and again, thank you to our guests. Thanks for listening. Please stay well and healthy, and we'll see you next time.